If they built a migrant camp big enough for tens of thousands of people, that would, if you cover like the whole U.S., that would be less than a month worth. And so this wouldn't actually house that many compared to how many are coming into the United States right now. But regardless, continuing on, it says this. On Thursday, the House passed Representative Nicole, the legislation known as the Protecting Our Communities from Failure to Secure the Border Act, to block the federal government from using federal lands to house illegal aliens in a 224 to 203 vote. In other words, a pretty big loss for the Democrats on that. Notably, some of them did vote with Republicans. Now, that being said, Democrat-led cities are actually still pushing that same agenda. This only blocked it from the federal level. So at least as of now, and unless Biden declares like a humanitarian crisis and, just avoids Congress altogether in this, which personally I think would be very dangerous for him politically, especially going into 2024, and because the migrant issue is pretty divisive even among Democrats. Regardless of any of this, you have major cities already enacting this type of policy. Now, it seems, though, that really all the money they can possibly spend is far, far from enough, and it's a self-perpetuating issue, because the more they give free housing, the more they give free health care, the more they give free benefits, the more people want to come, and especially to the cities that are giving it out. If you were told, in your whatever country you're from, actually a lot of them from China right now, if you were told that whatever country you're coming from, that if you go to America, they will pay for your travel, they will help you cross the border, they'll give you like GPS locations, all you have to do is, maybe just try to shimmy through between the cartels and, give them the United Nations bucks, they hand you whatever else. They will bus you, they will fly you into the United States, you can choose where you go, and once you're there, you can decide, well, do you want to go to Texas, where you're probably not going to get a lot of benefits? Do you want to go to Florida, where you might not get that much? Or do you want to go to New York, where the law requires them to give you a free house, a free hotel room? They're getting like 4-star treatment here. Where would you go? You're going to go to the place that's going to give you the best handout, because for a lot of these individuals, they're economic refugees. They're not fleeing humanitarian crisis. They're fleeing, the 9-to-5 work week. They're coming here. They're coming here for free handouts because they're offering them free handouts. Now, New York and a lot of other places are already building migrant housing, because, again, the law requires them to do it. And already, when they build these things, maybe they can house 5,000 people, which is a pretty dang big, housing project if you think about it. If you're getting that many people every week or every month or even once every few months, how many can you build before the city goes bankrupt? That's the issue a lot of people are facing right now. And it's not just New York. Let me show you this. It says here, construction is underway for a massive camp to house illegal immigrants in Chicago, Illinois, and city officials appear to be trying to hide the matter from local residents and news stations. Repurposing a parking lot for a now defunct Jewel Osco store, city worker crews have reportedly been active at the site as late as 1 a.m. according to locals. Now, Chicago, of course, they're dealing with a lot of other problems. They don't necessarily have the money for stuff like this. And keep in mind, too, this is one of the more, woke cities, and they have a lot of, free handout policies. Individuals there who are already on welfare and who already, rely on the government for, their basic quality of life are now having to watch as people who are not even citizens, people who are violating the law by their very, by their very presence in this nation, are being treated better than they are. How do you think it's going to work at the polls? But again, regardless of this, they're building this across the U.S., mostly Democrat-led cities, New York and so on. And a lot of them are trying to do this as rapidly as possible, because as soon as winter comes, you're not going to be sleeping outside in winter. You're not going to be pitching tent in, Times Square, or, sleeping in the subways or something like that. Even those get pretty cold. They're facing a real humanitarian crisis, that if these cities don't build something to keep people warm enough to not die when it gets cold out, well, things are going to get pretty rough. And of course,
And
if
you
the
always go
migrants
home.
decide that they have to go elsewhere, like migrate south, maybe a little further south, maybe really far south, we'll see what happens. But really, they're facing a serious crisis if people decide to stay, and these cities have to deal with, life or death situations. And again, most of these can only hold up maybe 1,000 or a couple thousand people. The most they can build is very, very, very far from being enough. And again, the budgets can't keep up with it. Meanwhile, let me show you this. A trucking company in Chattanooga was forced to pay the federal government, a $700,000 fine for what the government said were discriminatory hiring practices. And what were those discriminatory hiring practices? Let me show you this. It says here, according to the DOJ, the Department of Justice, the company, quote, routinely discriminated against non-U.S. citizens by requiring lawful permanent residents to show their permanent resident cards, known as green cards, and by requiring other non-U.S. citizens to show documents related to their immigration status. In other words, the company was checking to see when they were hiring people if they could legally hire them. Now, go back to the late Bush administration. Go back to even the early Obama administration. This was the law in the United States. I would argue it's still the law in the United States. You can't illegally hire people. You're supposed to check whether they are legally able to work. And again, part of that is because they have to pay taxes. Normally you have to have some kind of ID to pay taxes with. And if you don't have some kind of worker permit, how is the government going to tax it? That's the argument for it. A lot of people get around that by stealing people's identities. And there are, of course, large-scale facilities all across the U.S. and most of the major cities that assist people in doing that operate illegally, but with the, let's say, passive ignorance of the authorities. It's an accepted form of identity theft, basically. And, of course, people get illegal identities using that method because, again, they have to show that they are legally able to work, even if they do it illegally to get the IDs for that. How can a company then be charged by the federal government by asking people to prove they can legally work?
Rest my
Let me
case.
show you more. Kevin Lynn is the executive director for the Institute for Sound Public Policy, which advocates for American workers. It says Lynn called the practice lawfare, legal warfare, the weaponization of the legal system. And he said this: the U.S. government seems to be engaging in lawfare based on questionable claims of unfair employment practices of aliens, rather than focusing its efforts on behaviors that displace American workers. Now, in addition to all of this, mass migration and free handouts for citizens are again conflicting with the race narrative. And it's causing some really serious divisions among people based on the, racial advocacy camps. Let me show you this on that. Here's a statement, it says, from Reverend Jesse Jackson, one of the biggest, outspoken individuals on the whole race narrative. Again, whose advocacy for sanctuary cities put his hometown in a pretty big mess in the first place. It says this: Reverend Jesse Jackson joined Johnson at a West Side church the same day for an announcement on expanding migrant services throughout area churches because of the lack of shelter space. And Jackson, who has long advocated for migrant rights, too, urged more action out of Washington. He said this: laws need to be enforced at the border. And he said more resources are required in cities like Chicago. You get that? Jesse Jackson, of all people, is saying laws need to be enforced at the border. They have gone so incredibly far left that they're losing the support of the far left, of the normal far left. That's what things are at right now because of these contradictions developing within these policies.
I'll be home for Christmas.
And this is also, as they go out of business, reducing the amount of tax dollars available for many of these cities that need them, for example, to pay for mass migration camps. They have less business, less taxes, they have less money. What do? Let me show you this. The BLM and leftist campaign to defund the police while pushing light on crime policies is now backfiring. Lo and behold, you defund the police, you might have more crime. And now Democrat-led cities mostly are trying to pull back the policies because they're finding that dropping support for these, or supporting these things, was damaging to the basic well-being and their tax dollars, for the average citizen. They're dropping support now, even for Black Lives Matter, and they're also facing really big lawsuits, and probably a lot more going forward, over the lack of law enforcement. You have a delinquent government in some of these cities because they're not enforcing the laws, they're not protecting the citizens. What is the purpose of them? If you become delinquent, if you don't serve the basic role of government, then what are you doing? In other places, businesses are just folding and going out of business because of rampant crime and theft. Here's San Francisco, one of the capitals of this. It says here, a combination antique shop, printmaker, and event venue in San Francisco is expected to be auctioned as of next year. It says the business, known as Box SF and owned by Mark Sackett, is hosted in a building that currently has a broken window, and its address, which I won't say, is next door to a drug sobering center. Not the best place you'd want to be, I assume. It says Sackett told the San Francisco Chronicle that he purchased the building at $1.575 million in 2004, but now cannot be refinanced because as many as 30 lenders have refused to help the existing $2.5 million mortgage. It says as individual, Sackett, he expects the building will be sold at a massive loss due to 6 lenders telling him they, quote, are not making commercial real estate loans in San Francisco due to the state of the city. They can't stay in business even if they want to. Here's New York, another case. It says here, retailers across New York State say there's no end in sight to the rising epidemic of organized shoplifting rings. In other words, organized crime, shoplifting rings. And it says it warns it could lead to even more store closures, increased costs to consumers, and threats of violence against store employees. It says store owners said they lost $4.4 billion in New York alone last year as a result of retail theft, which they add to the urgency for Governor Kathy Hochul to crack down on them. And she's really not, by the way. In addition to this, now you have bodega workers arming themselves because they don't believe the police are going to protect them nor enforce the laws, even though many of them will be punished by the law, ironically, rather than the thieves, if they do choose to defend themselves, as we've seen again and again in New York. But it says here as well, Kathy Hochul vetoed a bipartisan bill just last week to the charging of store owners that would have created a task force to combat organized theft. Remember, when they defunded the police in New York, do you know what they got rid of? They got rid of many things, but one of them was the division that was investigating organized crime. A lot of us, when we think of organized crime, we think of like the mafia, but it's not just that. It's gangs, street gangs. And now you have street gangs getting involved in what they're saying is just organized theft, where individuals get together and they raid the Apple store, or they raid the Walmart, where they raid the CVS. It's a smash and grab thing where they take everything they can. And of course, you have businesses now trying to lock up their goods because brick and mortar stores are no longer financially feasible if they're not being protected. It doesn't end there. Here's Minneapolis. Businesses in Minneapolis are facing the same policies, but the businesses are fighting back by suing. It says here, let me show you. Several stores at the location where George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police in 2020 have sued the city, accusing the city of neglecting the area and hurting business. It says a lawsuit filed in mid-November in state court also named the mayor Jacob Frey and other officials, and that accuses the city of not properly policing the area since Floyd's death. In other words, they're saying the government has become delinquent. They're not enforcing laws anymore. They're not protecting businesses. They're not defending the basic rights of the average citizen. So what are they doing? It says here that this lawsuit also accuses the city of blocking the intersection that is now known as George Floyd Square with concrete barriers for more than a year after Floyd's death, keeping customers from entering. It says the combination has turned the area into a hub for violent crime, the lawsuit says. I feel sorry for the business owners. Now look, again, this is a problem across the whole U.S. Take Washington, for example. Washington, D.C., heart of America. And facing this problem, what's happening? The government in Washington, D.C., they're spending over $250,000 in taxpayer money on what? To rename Black Lives Matter Plaza. And why are they doing that? Because for some reason they're drawing some kind of line in Washington, D.C., which is by no means conservative. They say crime is skyrocketing in the area around Black Lives Matter Plaza, and for some reason they're associating skyrocketing crime with Black Lives Matter. Washington, D.C. It says this. Taxpayers in Washington are footing the bill for a $270,000 paint job. Imagine paying that money to paint a street. But it says they're paying this money for a paint job to refresh Black Lives Matter Plaza, as violent crime in the district has spiked 40% since last year. It says the move to repaint the anti-police street art, which features a 50-foot yellow letters along 2 blocks of 16th Street outside the White House, comes as the district has implemented millions in budget cuts to the Metropolitan Police Department over the past several years, and crime has skyrocketed.
Yep.
That being said, if you're wondering about the impacts of, legalizing crime, they've also legalized drugs in a lot of countries and decriminalized drugs in a lot of the United States. Now, one of the big thoughts with this is that, if you decriminalize drugs, people will stop using the hard drugs. And a lot of people who use drugs point to like Amsterdam, and they say, yeah, you can buy, heroin or whatever else they sell there, but people typically don't. And so many different countries and many different cities have either decriminalized or legalized drugs. And they're finding the results of that have been the opposite. It's killing people by, the tens of thousands. It is causing rampant crime. It's causing serious issues of overdoses, even ones that don't lead to death. It's overwhelming the hospitals. It's causing massive psychosis because people are losing their minds on these drugs. And it's causing general chaos all around the world. The push to legalize drugs is leading to even more crime and even more problems. Lo and behold, as many argue that it would in the first place. And because of this, states and even entire countries are starting to drop the agenda of saying that drugs are somehow okay. Let me show you this. AFP, it says in Ecuador, the new president, it says, repealed a policy that allowed for the possession of small amounts of drugs without prosecution on Friday, in a move that he said would counter micro-trafficking. It says the center-left president ordered the Ministry of Interior to repeal the rules adopted by former socialist president Rafael Correa, in force since 2013 to help focus police action on dealers rather than consumers, because the thought was, don't go after all the drugs. The victims are the users. Go after the people selling them. That was the mentality. Turns out that doesn't work. It says here that the new president, who was recently sworn in, had promised to eliminate the policy on the campaign trail, saying this, that it, quote, encourages micro-trafficking in schools and creates a whole generation of addicted children. It notes that a long, peaceful haven between major cocaine exporter Colombia, Peru, Ecuador has now seen violence explode in recent years as enemy gangs with links to Mexican and Colombian cartels are fighting for control. It says homicides quadrupled between 2018 and 2022, and they're climbing to a record 26 per 100,000 inhabitants. Turns out it doesn't work. Now look, legalizing drugs does the opposite of what people claim. I understand people these days, they think marijuana is not a big deal. But if you look at what happened in places that have legalized marijuana in the United States, you have problems like this as well. It didn't get rid of the cartels. It didn't get rid of the gangs. What happened? Well, you could argue part of it might be because of government red tape. In places like California, in places like all around the Midwest, who's running the grows? It is the cartels operating now on American soil because they can do so without punishment or with just fines. Or it's Chinese gangs that are using actual slave labor on American soil. We have actual slavery on American soil. We have Mexican cartels operating on American soil. And why are they doing that? Because the cost of doing it illegally and just taking a fine is less than having to pay for the permits and other things if you do it legally. And even if you have a legal operation, you have to face death threats from your competition because they're treating the legalized business in the same way they treated the illegal business, with violent turf wars. That is now in the United States. It's no longer on the other side of the border.
Yep.
That's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and as always, stay informed, stay free.